I am Jerome Wright, and I will be guiding you through CSEC biology. Now, the topic for this morning is classification. And I know you may have questions, what is classification and all of that. Now, through today's lessons, at the end of today's lessons, all those questions will be answered. So I know in grade 9, some schools, grade 8, you did characteristics of living organism. So you already know what are living organisms. You have been through all the features. So now that you know what are living organisms, we're going to tell you or show you how these living organisms are classified. Now, the objectives for this morning's lesson, as projected, you need to know how to define classification. You also need to appreciate the importance of classification, describe 2 types of classification, and you also want to be able to list the hierarchy of classifying living organisms, as well as state the major kingdoms and giving at least 2 examples of organisms for each kingdom. By extension also, for Plantae and Animalia, you also need to know the different phylums, giving examples, and also the classes for 2 of the phylums that we're going to look at later on. Now, some of you might know I said classification as a problematic topic, and you may feel as if going into this topic you're somehow not too familiar with it, content, meaning it's new to you. I will feel this very same way, but classification is not anything new, right? You have been classifying things your entire life and you may not even know it. In your rooms, you have areas where you place your different clothes. In Jamaica, we have all different types of clothes. We have your yard clothes, you have the clothes for going out, you have the church clothes. And those clothes are put away separately so that you can be able to identify them, get them when you need to do so. So we're going to do a little activity in terms of ease the tension a little bit. So on the board, you have these organisms that are here. Now, I want you to look at these organisms carefully, and I want you to think of 2 things that we can use to separate these organisms into 2 different groups. So you have the list on the board, and we want you to think of things that can use to separate them into groups. Oh yes, I hear you say wings. Okay. So you see that there are some organisms with wings and there are some without wings. The ones that have wings are, you have this one right here, wings, and this one with wings also, that one with wings, and that one over there also have wings. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 organisms with wings, and we have 2 without wings. So there you have 2 sets of groups, organisms with wings and organisms without wings. What other feature can you look at and use to put them into 2 different groups? Very good. I can look at antennae. So you have some with antenna and some without antenna. Those with antenna are this right here, is these and that one over there. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 organisms that have antennae, and you have 1, 2, 3 without. So there you go, you have classified organisms, and I'm sure you can find different other features that can be used to place them in different groups, such as the amount of legs. Some have 8 legs, there are some with 6 legs, and so forth. So it's a classification is not nothing that is hard. Right? You can do it. Right? So it's not anything to get apprehensive about. Now, based on the activity that we just did, you can already know what classification is all about. It's about grouping organisms into groups based on their similarities or how closeness they are to each other. So organisms are classified based on similarities. Now, the importance of classification. Just the scenario that I gave to you with you putting your clothes in different areas so that you can easily find them when you need to. Same thing with organisms. There are millions of organisms in the world. And for scientists to be able to identify them, they are placed in groups so they can be easily be found. And if you come across a new organism, you can easily identify where that organism fits. So it helps us to identify living organisms as well as understanding the diversity of living organisms. And two, it helps to study the features, you know, what makes bird different from reptiles, or is there any similarities between birds and reptiles? So it gives us a feel of how the organism differs and how similar they are. And also, point 2 and point 3 kind of interlink because it has to do with interrelationship between the different groups, or one group is related to each other, or how much are they different from each other. Now, this whole idea of classification was brought forward by Carl Linnaeus. It was started by Aristotle, and then Carl Linnaeus takes the work a bit further. And what he does is that he said living organisms are classified into these groups. So we start with a broad group first, and then we have subgroups of these broad groups. So we started with domain. However, for your CSEC syllabus, we don't ask you to know about domains, but hey, you're here, you're study for life. You don't study for just exams. So it's not on your syllabus, but I feel you need to mention it. Right? But your main focus would start from kingdoms to species. And you need to know the order in which they are placed. So you need to know that phylum comes after kingdom, classes after phylum, and so forth. You need to know the order in which they appear. And so there are mnemonics that can help you to understand or to remember the order in which they fall. And some of these are kids prefer cheese over fried green spinach, or King Philip came over for good soup. And you can make up your own, right? Yeah, and get creative so that you can remember the order in which the hierarchy comes. Now, as I stated before, as you can see, as you go down the hierarchy, the amount of organisms, or the number of organisms decreases. Right? And this is because as you go down the group, organisms are becoming more and more closely related to each other. Right? Until we get a group of organisms that are so closely related that they can interbreed to produce viable, fertile offspring. All right, kind of getting ahead of myself. All right, so this is another mnemonics. Kid pick candies over fresh green salads. As I said, you can even make up your own, all right, to help you to remember the order in which the hierarchy falls. Now, as I was saying before, as you go down the group, you will find less and less organisms, because organisms are becoming closely and closely related as you move down the group. So you start off with 2 million organisms in terms of the kingdom Animalia, in what you're looking at. And as you go down the group, you find organisms are more closely related. For example, if you want to classify the grizzly bear, which is right here. So grizzly bear is in the kingdom Animalia. Right? And in the kingdom Animalia, there are over 2 million different organisms within that kingdom. Right? But as you go down, so for example, the phylum Chordata, some organism will be eliminated because some organism does not have that notochord, which is a primitive form of your spinal cord. So those organisms will be eliminated, right? Like your dragonfly right here does not have a primitive spinal cord, right? And so it'll be out. And a group of chordata is Mammalia, and those are the organisms that give rise to live youngs. They are warm-blooded. And as you move to that class, you find out that some organisms are going to be removed from the group, such as your birds. You find out they're no longer birds there, they're no longer fishes, and so forth. And so as you go down, you'll find organisms that are closely related, and so you end up with the grizzly bear, which is a species that you want to reach at. And so you find that by looking at this, you can see where the grizzly bear is closely related to the polar bear, because they share the same genus, but not the same species. And this term species is of vital importance, and I always tell my students that it's never species, it's always species. Right? So one species, two species, it's all about species. Now when we reach to the term species, according to the biological species concept, a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed to produce viable, and viable means living, fertile offspring. So you might want to write that down. So species is a group of organisms that can interbreed to produce viable, mean living, fertile offspring. So if two different organisms mate and the offspring is not viable, mean not living, or the organism is incapable of reproducing, then it's a possibility that both parents were of two different species. Right? And as we stated, Animalia, different organism within the Animalia, and we can see that cat and lion are closely related because they share the same genus. And that was a problem with artificial classification, where in artificial classification, looking at different types of classification, in artificial classification is where they look at the artificial or the morphology, called features of the organism, meaning they are the features that are easily observed. For example, fins and the absence of fins were used to classify organisms. So if organisms have fins, we put them into one group. But by now, we know that that's not an accurate way of representing an organism. Because if you look at fish and dolphins, both have fins, but they are not from the same group. Dolphins are mammals, and shark, for example, is a fish. Right? So that method of classification is not accurate, and that is an artificial method of classification. And that was a problem with artificial classification. You can't just say because two organisms look alike, mean that they belong to the same group. You never say the term looks are deceiving. So two things may look alike, but they do not belong to the same group. So that's how natural selection now comes in. So natural selection look beyond the fact that they look alike, but they start to look at how they reproduce, how they feed, how they behave in their habitat. So there is a more holistic approach to classification, unlike with artificial classification. One other example in artificial classification, take for example, as I was saying before the break, look at the shark and the dolphin. We say both of them are fins, so they belong to the same group. No. Dolphins are considered to be mammals, and sharks are considered to be fish. So they look alike, but not from the same group. So natural selection takes it a bit further. As I said, look at other things like their reproductive traits, how they feed, look at also their internal body structure, do they have a spinal cord, do they have a spinal cord, and so forth. So it's a more holistic approach to classification. And then we have the phylogenetic system, in which they involve now the genetic relationship between the organism. And so they also involve the evolutionary trend, see how these organisms changes over a period of time, and see the relationship that they share. And more modern way of classification is with the DNA, where they use gene mapping to find if organisms are closely related or they are not closely related. Right. So the more organisms or the more groups that organisms share will give you an idea of how closely they are related using Carolinius hierarchy of grouping organisms. So basically, as I said before, looking at this, you can see the relationship between all 4 organisms. And we can see that they share, all 4 share the same order. All right, they start to differ when it comes down to family, genus, and species. And as I was saying before the break, that species, the definition for a species are a group of organisms that can interbreed to produce viable, fertile offspring. And I use this to, you know, donkey in Jamaica, donkey and horse. So this is a donkey and this is a horse. And they interbreed to produce the mule. Now the mule is infertile. And the reason why the mule is infertile is because both parents are not from the same species. The horse and the donkey is not from the same species. So even though they produce a viable, living offspring, but this offspring is unable to reproduce because the parents were of different species. But as you go further, we also realize that that definition of species is now under question based on what is happening with the, I don't know if one of you have gone to Google and see the liger, which is a cross between the male lion and the female tiger. Lion and the tiger have 2 different species. They produce a liger. And they have found out that the female liger is fertile while the male liger is infertile. So that's the thing with biology. Things keep changing. That's why I encourage my students to always read. Right. Now, based on the Carlos-Linnaeus system of classified organism, it comes to the fact that each organism is given a scientific name. And the scientific name consists of the genus and the species. And that is why I call binomial nomenclature. So each organism is given a 2 name, just like how we have 2 names. We have our Christian name and our surname. So each organism has 2 names, all right? And that's why the binomial nomenclature comes in. And these 2 names is based on the organism genus and their species. So if I should go back, the scientific name for a cat would be Felis domestic. So the Felis would be like the Christian name, and the species would be like the surname. And if you look to see the genus name, always written in capital, start with a capital letter, and the species name starts with a common letter, and that's how it is written. All right? And sometimes they're underlined separately, or they are written in italics. Now, as I stated before, every organism has what is called a scientific name. And you may say, why is it that organisms need to have a scientific name? And this is what it is. The scientific name remains the same, right? Remains the same whether it is a culture or the language. The scientific name remains the same. The common name, however, changes due to culture and language. So in Jamaica, we know this as guinea. But if you go to some other areas, they call the same thing honeyberry. They call it Spanish lime. And in Barbados, it is known as ackee. And you can see that is why scientists do not refer to organisms by their common name, because the common name changes according to the culture or where the person is from. So if I go to Barbados and say I need some guinea, what we know as guinea to them, they know as ackee. So they were saying, what are you talking about? They will bring something different to you. And they say, no, what I want is guinea. But they will say, no, this is not guinea, this is ackee. So it will be confusion. Right? However, if you're in a group with scientists and you say the scientific name, then each scientist or taxonomist, because those are the ones who study the area of grouping organism, everybody will know what you're talking about when you mention the scientific name, because this is universal. Whether you speak English, Spanish, French, right? This name is universal. So there's no confusion when you mention the scientific name of an organism. Another thing with the common name is that it changes with language. So there's a language barrier, right? So We know dolphin in English, we say dolphin, but a person who's Chinese, when they say dolphin, because they don't speak English, they will not know what you're talking about. Right? But if you use a scientific name, then even though the person does not speak your language, they'll know exactly what you're talking about. And when I'm saying this, I'm not talking about a lay person, I'm talking about in the company of other scientists. Then able to know, identify organisms by using their scientific name. Now, the application of classification, we can use the dichotomous key, and that is what we use when we're out in the field to classify organisms. So we come across an organism that we are not familiar with, we are able to use this key, and we can narrow it down to actually state what organism we are looking at. And so this key uses a series of questions to classify or bring down organisms to identify them, what they really are. So you come across a vertebrate, and you have not seen it before. Right? So this is what the key does. It asks a series of questions and prompts you into identify the organism. So first, I see this organism I never saw before. Question asks, and these questions are in a database. Right? So one, does it have fur or no fur? It has fur, then we know that it's a mammal. So right away you can actually go some further studies to find out what type of mammal is it. No fur, then we can go to the next two questions. Does it have feathers or no feathers? If it has feathers, then it's a bird. And then we can go further into that. No feathers, then we need to look at its fertilization. Does it internal fertilization or external fertilization? If it is external fertilization, does it have gills or does it have no gills? And so we can further go and see what type of organism it is. So this is how the key is applied. It's applied when you're out in the field, you come across a new organism, you want to identify it. So we are now classifying organism into domains. As I said to you before, the domains is not part of your syllabus, but we like to mention it. So there are three domains, or three broad groups in which organisms are classified into. You have the archaea and eubacteria, and you have the eukarya, where most of the living organisms are classified into. And this word may sound strange to you, but you have come across it already, because when you're doing cells, you were introduced to prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Right? Prokaryotic cells are cells that form within this domain right here of archaea and eubacteria. Right? So these bacteria are organisms that does not have any organelles. And organelles, we are talking about small structures within plants and animal cells that carry out a specific function. So these organisms, you'll not find any nucleus or chloroplast within them. Right? So their genetic material is just within the cytoplasm. And these are your bacteria. Right? Now, all organisms are classified into 5 different kingdoms. And this is where we need to know what separates one kingdom from the next and organism that belongs to the different kingdoms. So we're going to start with Monaria. It used to be 6 kingdoms, but virus is no longer a kingdom. Right? So it's now 5. That's why I say biology, you have to keep on reading because things may change. So the Monaria are your bacteria. As I said, there's no membrane-bound organelles, and they reproduce by binary fission. So all your bacteria would belong to this kingdom right here. Then we have the next kingdom, which is Protista. They sometimes are, most of them are unicellular, sometimes are multicellular, but what separates them from bacteria is that they have membrane-bound organelles. So they have nucleus, some have chloroplast, right? They have mitochondria, right? So they are not considered to be bacteria because they have organelles. And organisms that belong to this kingdom are like your amoeba, your paramecium, your algae. Those are organisms that belong to this kingdom right here. Then you have the fungi. These organisms may look like plants, but they are not plants. The reason why is that their cell wall is not made up of cellulose. In plant cell, you know that the cell wall is made up of cellulose. But what they have found out is that for fungi, the cell wall is made up of chitin, so they cannot consider to be plants. They are not considered to be plants also because they are heterotrophs, and we know that plants are autotrophs, meaning that they are able to make their own food. But fungi are not autotrophs, they are heterotrophs. Now we're into the kingdom Plantae. Right? And these organisms are organisms that are able to make their own food by photosynthesis. And you know what photosynthesis is. Right? And their cell wall, unlike fungi, their cell wall is made up of cellulose. So even though for fungi it may look similar to plants, but they are not plants. And of course, you know, your fungi, like your mushrooms, your toadstool, your yeast, all those are considered to be fungi. Right? And plants, able to make their own food, and their cell wall is made up of cellulose. Now, when it comes down to plant, you need to know the different phylums within the plant. And these are different phylums. These are the common name for the different phylums. You can read up the scientific name. Right? So the Plantae, subgroup non-flowering and flowering plants. The non-flowering plants are further divided into spore-bearing and naked seed. And naked seeds mean that their seed is not enclosed within an ovary, right? Unlike the natural fruits. Right? So you have the gymnosperms, and you have the mosses, you have the ferns, you know the ferns. For those of you who have traveled through Fern Gully, you know the ferns, and the ferns reproduce by using spores, right? They don't produce seeds. And the mosses are plant-like, they don't have any roots. They have what is called rhizoids, but they don't have roots. They have what is called rhizoids. The ferns produces spores, but they don't have, they have roots, but they don't have seeds, so they're produced by spores. And then you have the gymnosperms. Christmas is coming up, so like your Christmas tree, your pine trees, those are what fall under the kingdom gymnosperms. Now, the next kingdom is angiosperms. And angiosperms is further divided into monocots and dicots. So the phylum within the plant kingdom are your mosses, your ferns, your gymnosperms, and angiosperms are flowering plants. And within flowering plants, you have monocots and dicots. And how do we separate monocots from dicots? The monocots, you can look at in terms of their root system. For monocots, if you should go outside and pull up a grass, you find out that all the roots are almost the same size. Right? So in monocots, they have what is called fibrous roots, where all the roots are of the same size. For dicots, they have what is called a taproot. So you have one major root, and then you have smaller roots coming off. You can also look at the leaf system, where for monocot, the venation is parallel, and in dicot, you have branching venation of the leaf. So these are some of the things that you can use to separate the monocots from the dicotyledonous. Now for Animalia, we don't have any cell wall. Right? We have cell membrane but no cell wall. We are heterotrophs, and I'm saying we because I'm part of that kingdom. And so we cannot make our own food, so we depend on other organisms for food. Now the kingdom Animalia is further divided. First, you have vertebrates and non-vertebrates. And I want to say that vertebrates is not a phylum in the kingdom Animalia. Right? So I don't want to see any of my students writing, classifying organism and write kingdom Animalia and phylum vertebrate. Vertebrate and non-vertebrates are just, some resources says subphylum, but they're not phylums. Over this side, organisms with backbone are in the phylum Chordata. Chordata is a phylum that organisms with backbones fall under. Right? And these are different classes under the phylum Chordata. So if I should classify a cow, the kingdom would be Animalia, the phylum would be Chordata, and the class that cows fall under would be mammals. Right? So these are different classes within the kingdom Animalia. Remember, you have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So you have to know the hierarchy in which organisms are classified. Right? So looking at this, you can know the difference between a fish and a snake. So both of them are the same phylum Chordata, but they have differences in terms of the reptiles have dry, scaly skins, but the fish, they have scales on their body, but their skins are not as dry as that of the reptiles. Right? Also, the fish have gills, reptiles have no gills. So these are some of the differences between the fish and the reptiles. And you need to know the differences between the different classes within the phylum Chordata. Over here, we have a wide range of different phylums. I need to highlight that Protozoa is no longer a phylum in the kingdom Animalia. It has been replaced by Porphyria, or what is sponges. For those who watch SpongeBob SquarePants, yes. So SpongeBob would fall in the kingdom sponges. So Protozoa is no longer a phylum, sorry, in the kingdom Animalia. We have flatworms, annelids, echinoderms. All of these are phylum. Arthropods are also phylum as well. So under invertebrates, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 different phylums. Your CSEC syllabus asks you to further divide arthropods into different classes. So the phylum arthropods is further divided into 4 classes, and these are arachnids, crustacean, insect, and myriapods. So just like how Chordata is further divided into classes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different classes, the phylum Arthropoda is further divided into classes. So you need to know the different classes that comes on an Arthropoda. Right? But for the phylums, for the invertebrates, you don't need to go any further. You just need to know the organisms for the different phylum and the characteristics of these organisms. Right? So this is classification, and for those who watch SpongeBob SquarePants, right, you can also classify the organism within SpongeBob SquarePants. For example, as you know, SpongeBob would be sponges right here where Protozoa is. Remember, Protozoa is no more. So SpongeBob would be there. Squidward would be a mollusk. Mr. Crab would be a crustacean. So if I should classify Mr. Crabs, then it would be kingdom Animalia, phylum Arthropod, and class crustacean. Right? This just summarizes the lesson with the major kingdoms and organisms that are found within the different kingdoms. So I hope that you have learned a lot, and this is it for CSEC Biology.